Hello and welcome to America in Focus, powered by the Center Square. I'm Dan McCaleb, executive editor of the Center Square Newswire service. Joining me again today is Casey Harper, the Center Square's Washington, D.C. bureau chief. Tuesday, just a few days from now, April 18th, is tax day, the deadline for most Americans to file their income tax returns with the federal government. Have you filed your taxes yet, Casey?
I have not. I'm getting around to it, like probably a lot of people.
Same here. We've started, but we'll have to finish up this weekend. With tax day just a few days away, it's appropriate for us to scrutinize how the federal government spends our tax dollars. And Casey, you did that this week, particularly going back to the trillions of dollars that Congress appropriated during the COVID-19 pandemic. And man, it seems like every week we're learning about more fraud and questionable spending. Tell us about this latest round of scrutiny.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's no way for us in this podcast to go through all of the different examples of fraud because there was $4.6 million allocated, appropriated by Congress, during COVID and afterwards, which
trillion. I just want to clarify.
Trillion. Yeah. What did I say? Did I say million? $1 trillion. About 4.1 trillion has been spent. Actually, Republicans are trying to get back that extra $500 billion. I don't think they're going to succeed in that because they don't have the votes, but they're trying to get back some of that money that was appropriated. But these COVID relief funds, as you said, more and more time goes on, we see more and more examples of, wait a minute. And it's not that surprising. I mean, anytime the federal government spends a lot of money really quickly, once you start digging through the rubble, you start realizing, what's going on here? Because if you're a lobbyist, that's the perfect time to sneak in and get a sentence and a bill that, pats somebody on the back or something like that. And then there's just straight up government incompetence. This money was not handled properly. It was not paid properly. A good example of that would be something we've written about some at thecentersquare.com. And it was these COVID relief payments, right? So we know, whether it was unemployment or the stimulus, that billions of dollars of those payments were just sent to the wrong people. And much of that was sent to fraudsters, right? So people who fraudulently set up accounts to receive it. So, we can go through different examples, but you're absolutely right that there's no end to the waste, fraud, and abuse in this case.
And one of the criticisms of the relief plan, not necessarily related to fraud, but related to decision-making by the federal government, sending billions and billions of dollars to wealthy hospitals that have recorded huge profits, and far fewer dollars going to those rural hospitals that are sort of on the brink. Tell us about that.
Yeah, I mean, the pandemic, of course, was a time when a feast or famine for a lot of businesses. So a lot of small businesses really suffered, went out of business, weren't able to pay their rent. But we also know that some of the wealthiest Americans actually made a lot of money during the pandemic, and big businesses did really well because they had the resources to weather the storm. And we saw a sort of similar pattern with wealthy hospitals actually made, real profits and did really well during the pandemic, whereas poor hospitals really lost a lot of money. So you would think that the money that was passed by Congress to help hospitals would help the poor hospitals stay afloat, but it doesn't look like that's what happened. And lawmakers are pretty upset about this. House Oversight and others are launching an investigation to see, how did Health and Human Services distribute this money? How did they make those decisions? How could it be, how could it be that this happened? And that, there's also a political question, which is some of these, wealthier hospitals could be in cities, which are more Democrat run, whereas poor rural hospitals could be in more red areas that could have been neglected. That's a little bit of speculation there, but that's the kind of question I think that Republicans have in their mind as they do these investigation or this particular hospital investigation. I mentioned the federal unemployment benefits and there's so many examples there. The Paycheck Protection Program, I'll throw out another example of fraud that was pointed to by one of the experts I talked to at the Heritage Foundation. The Paycheck Protection Program, PPP, people probably remember that, familiar with that, experienced a large amount of fraud. And one example was a Georgia man who used his PPP loan to buy a $57,000 Pokemon trading card.
There also have been complaints too, or criticism, for example, how schools spent their COVID relief dollars. As schools shut down during the pandemic, we've since found out the massive amount of learning loss that students suffered. Yet many schools use the money not on tutors to catch kids up, but on the diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts.
Yeah, you're right. And there's good examples of that. I mean, but what's happening here is so much of the money isn't going where it's supposed to go. And then the money that is going where it's supposed to go is being wasted, right? Or misused. Or just being spent, even if it's not necessarily a bad cause, it's just not really what you would think COVID relief would be about. COVID relief should be about, getting small businesses back on their feet, helping people. We just saw so many restaurants get shut down, so many hospitals overwhelmed. You would think that's what it went to, or helping, schools recover and buy the equipment they need to keep things safe and everything. But the school example you pointed to, California used these funds for quote unquote environmental literacy, ethnic studies, and LGBTQ plus cultural competency, right? So that's an example. New York, another, pretty left state, used part of their $9 billion to give staff, quote, culturally responsive, sustaining instruction. And that's really like code word for some of the CRT, diversity, equity, inclusion training. Culturally responsive is one of the new buzzwords that I'm picking up as I read through grants and legislation. Cultural competency is kind of code for a lot of this equity stuff. And even it was explicitly stated here that they hired equity warriors, which were people, basically to push equity efforts in the school at taxpayer expense. Illinois, where you are, Dan, they got $5.1 billion from one of these funds, and they, used it to emphasize equity and diversity and make equity-driven investments. So, we can go down the list, but at least 10 other states had plans that use their funds to put racially based curriculum or critical race theory curriculum into school. So a lot of this, and it's interesting because if you were a Republican or a Democrat and you opposed COVID relief funding, someone would say, wow, you hate people. Basically, you don't believe in COVID, or you don't want to help people who are suffering from COVID. But as time goes on, we see that so much of that money wasn't really about COVID at all.
Keep up with our scrutiny of federal government spending at thecentersquare.com. For Casey Harper, I'm Dan McCaleb. Please subscribe, and thank you for listening.